We only know how much we love someone when we know what we're willing to sacrifice. I never asked myself that kind of question. Without knowing why, without asking myself how far I would be prepared to go for love. Sometimes it's better not to know.
Are you prepared to suffer to save your son? You have 5 minutes to cut off the last section of one of your fingers in front of the camera. If you succeed, you will get your reward.
My name's Scott Shelby. I'm a private detective. I'm investigating the case of the origami killer.
I'd like a room.
Agent Norman Jaden, FBI.
Ethan Mars has had psychological problems since his first son died. Feels responsible for his death.
Ash, I want you to assign every available man to finding Ethan Mars. To keep an eye on the train stations, the airports, the bus terminals. I want every cop in the city on his ass, so that if he moves, we know about it.
Everything I did for love.
Hey everyone, it's Soul here, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Heavy Rain came out 14 years ago, and I, being only 10 years old at the time of its release, did not play it back then, and I only just finished playing through it for the first time ever about a month ago. So I wanted to talk about it with you guys today. When playing through the game, my initial thoughts and feelings was that it was actually really fun and exciting. It's a very enjoyable game to play through. However, this game is sadly very flawed. There are quite a few issues with the narrative story and quite a few plot holes with some of our key characters. So let's break this game down and see how it holds up by today's standards. As always, please remember to hit that like button, click subscribe to see more videos from me, and leave a comment down below. Here is your one and only warning that this video contains spoilers. Alright, grab your glasses, put on that glove, and let's scan into it. Heavy Rain is a game created by Quantic Dream that was originally released back in 2010 on the PS3. It has since been released and remastered for both the PS4 in 2016 and for PC gaming in 2019. The game itself is created by David Cage, who both wrote and produced it, and has gone on to become the first of his big 3 games. The more games that I play and the more research that I've done on David Cage's games and stories, the more conflicted that I start to get, because with his stories and his games, the general consensus of people online is that they are both insanely good, but also so incredibly bad at the same time. There's aspects of greatness within them, but there's also some really terrible and stupid mistakes. There's no sort of in-between, no middle ground, and it becomes incredibly frustrating when you play the games. And that is exactly what has happened with Heavy Rain. Now, the game itself has gone on to become a sort of launching point for the butterfly effect decision-based subgenre in narrative storytelling video games. I had always kind of heard about Heavy Rain being mentioned at the start of almost every single Let's Play of Until Dawn, of The Dark Pictures, and even in Let's Plays of Life is Strange, with the trailer for Life is Strange even drawing a direct comparison. And in my opinion, I do think that this game deserves all of the praise that it gets for being the sort of frontrunner for this genre of gaming. For the time period of its release, the game had groundbreaking graphics, and it gained so much success and popularity for that during its initial release. But before I go into all of my thoughts and feelings on this story and game, what actually happens? What is the story of Heavy Rain? Well, we get to play as a few different characters. We get to play as Scott Shelby, Madison Page, Ethan Mars, and Norman Jaden. But our main protagonist is Ethan Mars. He is a loving father of 2 sons. He lives in this dream house. He has a great wife, and he is seen living this sort of picturesque, perfect lifestyle. Sadly, however, his oldest son, Jason, dies in a car accident before we cut to 2 years later in the future. We learn that Ethan and his wife are now divorced, and there's some news spreading around the city of someone called the Origami Killer with an MO of kidnapping young boys around the age of 10, drowning them in rainwater before he ends up dumping their bodies at a random location near the railroad tracks. Now, when watching his second son, Sean, at the playground one day, Ethan suffers from one of his sort of reoccurring blackouts, and when he finally comes to, he wakes up in the middle of a random street holding a piece of origami. Sean is nowhere to be seen, and after searching for him everywhere, Ethan rushes to tell the police officers that his son is missing. Meanwhile, we play as an FBI agent by the name of Norman Jayden and Scott Shelby, a private detective, who are both investigating different leads for the origami killer. Scott is seen going around to the victims' families, collecting bits of information and evidence that the police have missed, with the help of one of the victims' mothers by the name of Lauren. At the same time, Norman is seen searching for clues at the crime scene with his cool high-tech RE glasses before suddenly he finds a lead on the make and model of a car discovered through the tire tracks. Now Ethan, being pestered by press, receives a mysterious letter in the mail which leads him to a box that's left for him at the train station. This box contains a loaded gun, 5 origami pieces that are numbered, a cell phone, and a memory card with his name on it. Going to a motel for a bit of privacy, Ethan plugs the memory card in, and he is horrified to find a video of Sean trapped in a tank of rising rainwater. Sean has in fact been taken by the origami killer. In an attempt to rescue Sean, Ethan follows the instructions on the first origami piece and goes to undertake the first deadly trial. These trials end up being sort of crazy Saw-like tests to see if he will do anything, absolutely anything, even if this thing threatens his life, just to save his son. Depending on what you, as the player, pick, it will determine if Ethan will complete his trials, which gains him a few letters to the address where Sean is being held, or if Ethan fails. Meanwhile, Norman Jayden, our FBI agent, is dealing with the rule-breaking, cruel cop by the name of Carter Blake, who is insistent that every single suspect they see is probably the killer. But he ultimately ends up believing that the killer is Ethan and begins to chase him around the city. This makes things a bit challenging for the player, as they have to manage conversational choices with Blake when they play as Norman, while also trying to make sure that Ethan does not get caught by the police. Not believing that the killer is actually Ethan, Norman goes on to follow the lead with the car model he found earlier and has a few instances where he can actually be shot and killed if you make the wrong choice. Then, we have our fourth playable character by the name of Madison Page. She is staying at the same hotel as Ethan is, and she helps bandage him up after he goes through the brutal trials, and if you want them to, the pair can actually become a couple. It is, however, eventually revealed that Madison is an investigative journalist, and she ends up finding the clues to discover the origami killer. Scott Shelby, our private investigator going around talking to the families, is actually the origami killer. His brother was sadly trapped in a pipe that filled up with rainwater, and with their father being an alcoholic, his father essentially let his brother John die. So Scott has been committing all of these kidnappings and murders just to try and find a father who would risk his life to save his son. Scott had also sent Lauren away earlier in the game as a way to sort of hide his true actions, since he knew that Madison was starting to get on his tail and more violent acts would need to be committed. Scott tries to kill Madison by setting his apartment on fire, while Ethan finishes up the fifth trial finding the address to his son. Or, once again, might not find the address to Sean, depending on if you succeed the trials and if you escape Blake's attempt to catch Ethan. If you are caught by Blake the second time, Ethan will end up spending the rest of the game in the prison cell, and the survival of Sean is left up to Norman and Madison sections. But if you do get all three of them to survive and you get Norman to continue the investigation and not drop the case, then Ethan will find Sean just in the nick of time before he is confronted by Scott Shelby. Scott rants about how he's done all of this to find a truly devoted and loving father before Norman jumps in and saves Ethan from being shot. Norman and Scott have a bit of a showdown while Madison helps Ethan rescue Sean and avoids being shot at by the police who are waiting outside. Norman will end up defeating Scott and everyone gets to go home happily. Well, not really Norman, because it's suggested that he kind of got too addicted to the glasses and he sort of ends up not being able to tell the difference between reality and fiction based off of this hallucination scene. And Lauren also has a horrible ending because she has to deal with the realization that she kind of had a bit of feelings and had a bit of a fling with her son's murderer. Poor Lauren, man. She really got the worst ending. Now, obviously, there's a multiple of different combinations to this sort of rescue ending, with our three protagonists, Ethan, Madison, and Norman, all having a chance to fight Scott in different sort of pairs and patterns, or even just on their own. Then, of course, Sean could also die, meaning no one would have found him. We also have Ethan's ending, how should I call it, his gun ending, in which he sadly takes his own life after failing to rescue Sean. There are a lot of different ways that this game can end, and I think that's one of the reasons that this game became so popular at the time. I personally think I got one of the best, if not the best ending in my first playthrough of the game. I had saved everyone, I had Madison and Ethan become a couple, and the reason that I feel that it's the ultimate best ending is because I personally loved how every single character made it to that final warehouse battle. I loved the added tension of Blake and the police force being outside. It just made the ending experience feel 10 times more dramatic and full of tension, so that's why I personally feel this is the best one. But there are quite a few other really cool endings as well. Madison having to fight Scott is cool. Blake getting scared by the ghost of Norman if you get him killed is also quite a fun ending, and there's just so many different ways you can twist and turn this story. Now, with all of that said, I want to say that this game, it blew me out of the water, and I genuinely had so much fun playing through it. However, I do agree with all of these sort of reviews that this story is messy and it doesn't really make much sense. So let's try and figure out why I found this game to be so fun and outstanding despite all of its major flaws. For starters, I definitely went into this with very low expectations. I thought since this game had come out in 2010 that it would feel pretty dated all around. I also thought that the gameplay might be a bit slower like it was in the first couple of chapters. There was even a moment that I kind of thought it might be like Life is Strange in terms of the sort of relaxed feeling that Life is Strange provided. I also kind of thought that because the Life is Strange trailer drew that comparison to Heavy Rain, so I wasn't expecting the sort of upbeat rise in tension that we got later on. I was not expecting the good graphics because 2010 is 14 years ago. And even though I knew I was playing the slightly remastered version from 2016 for PS4, remasters don't tend to change the graphics too much or too drastically. And when I did look at a comparison video on YouTube, the visuals as a whole I think still hold up pretty well to this day. And since I wasn't expecting a whole lot from this game in general, once I saw the graphics, once I heard the great music and soundtrack, and once we got to that first trial and things started to really pick up with the story, I started to get so excited. I got sucked into this game and I loved the wild ride that this game provided. Now, the game itself is on the shorter end of things, being only around 10 hours, and I personally really liked how short and fast-paced the game was. I thought it worked really well in terms of it being a detective story as well. I loved the energy that this game created. The levels of excitement and nervous energy that I had felt when playing it was great. Every single trial had my nerves on edge, my heart was racing, my hands were sweating, and this game just did such a great job with getting my adrenaline up. I genuinely had so much fun and felt so many emotions when playing this game. The second trial was by far the worst one though, because aside from the feelings of claustrophobia that this tunnel was sort of creating, the amount of mind games that it caused me was absolutely insane. I was so worried that there might be a sudden gas leak or that these tunnels would suddenly start to fill up with water. There were so many bad scenarios that could have happened that I was kind of psyching myself out. I think the trials as a whole each do their job at playing these sort of mind games with Ethan and in extension with us as players. The fifth trial in particular is probably the most obvious one playing these sort of mind games on you with the fake poison. Even though you don't know that it's fake, there's that brief moment of panic that you feel that maybe, just maybe, Ethan might drop dead right this second. So I personally loved all of the stress and energy that these trials had created. I also personally found the overall atmosphere of the game to be great, and I loved switching between all of the characters. The game as a whole just has a really fun feel to it, which just is so enjoyable. The trials with all of the sort of quick time buttons was also really fun. Similar to my thoughts on Detroit Become Human, I do like that basically every single button on the PlayStation controller was required in some of these quick times. And even though it did cause some insane hand cramping at times, I still found it to be such a fun added little challenge. The walking mechanics and the camera angles, however, were not my favorites. If I'm being perfectly honest, they were kind of horrible to try and play with. The walking mechanics were a mess, and it was really frustrating at times not being able to control the camera angle when all I wanted to do was just spin around with the camera and look for different clues on the table or the area around me. It's something that they clearly fixed moving forward into their following games, but it's still very frustrating and aggravating when you're playing this one. Going back to the positives, I think that the murder mystery plotline and detective features to the story worked perfectly in pulling us into the story and creating some great tension. Since I had just talked about the clock tool in my Avatar video, I think this game does a great job with creating tension in the form of the clock tool, aka the growing amount of rainwater. The game is constantly reminding us, either through the start of each chapter and having the amount of rain in the corner of the screen, or by mentioning it through dialogue amongst the characters, that the water is rising and Sean is possibly another inch closer to drowning. So I'll give them a round of applause for using the writing tool really well. Another reason that I think I had an insanely positive reaction to the game is because I didn't really take too many breaks in between. I basically only took 2 breaks in between my live streams, and I didn't really get much time to actually think about the events that took place because, I was working during the day, and if I didn't work, I probably would have just kept playing the game all night. But since I didn't take any breaks when I was actually playing the game, and I just didn't have too much time in real life to give myself a moment to process the events, I ended up missing a lot of the clues and the foreshadowing events. It really wasn't until right before my 3rd and final live stream where I had a bit of time on the weekend to actually start to think about what happened and begin to piece together that maybe it could be Scott. I also feel that I just got a bit too invested in Ethan's story. I got too caught up in Ethan's trials and in the characters, but mainly I got caught up in Ethan's mental state, which distracted me from really looking at the rest of the story. I can completely understand that some people might have caught on right away and got a bit bored because they knew that it was going to be Scott as the killer, but I personally didn't have this issue. I think that sort of distraction in my real life from thinking about the game really actually made me feel a lot more invested and made the sort of detective experience a lot more enjoyable. Now, when speaking about Ethan's sort of mental state and him as a character in the game, his blackouts, and him seeing the drowned and dead bodies, this kinda leads us to our first major issue in the story. Ethan's blackouts never get explained or resolved. They just sort of disappear. I was so invested in his story, so not getting any sort of resolution to them was really upsetting by the end of the game. Now, looking into the director's cut, it turns out that these blackouts would have added a lot of changes to the entire story, and it would have ended up linking Ethan directly to Scott, the origami killer. Originally, Ethan was supposed to have a sort of nightmare sequence during these blackouts in which he would see the bodies of the drowned victims of the origami killer. This explains the sort of newspaper dialogue in his house in the final game, which right now makes no sense, but would have in the original sequences helped us draw the connection from Ethan to the origami killer through this drowned victim's face. We would have recognized him in the vision and the nightmare sequence, and then seen him on the newspaper cover. After the blackouts, like you see in the final version of the game, Ethan would wake up in Carnaby Square, which is eventually revealed to be the location where John, Scott's brother, had drowned. The writers went on to say that they were attempting to showcase that Ethan and Scott were somehow psychically linked. Anytime Scott harmed a kid, Ethan saw it, and anytime Scott folded an origami piece, so did Ethan. Now, according to the creators, this connection happened when Scott witnessed Ethan's accident 2 years ago. Yet, they ultimately decided to cut out these scenes in order to get rid of the almost supernatural connection that the 2 characters shared, and to keep the game a lot more grounded in realism. Yet, the sad reality is that doing this meant that Ethan's blackouts are never explained. I will say, I am quite glad that they took out the psychic connection because the story is definitely playing a lot more on real issues. You got trauma, mental health, grief, guilt, and loss. So I definitely think that taking out a supernatural element was the best choice. I do know that some people also feel like they should have removed his blackouts and visions and mentions of drowned bodies entirely, and that might have been the best way to do it, but at the same time, since the directors seem to have cut this out a bit too late in production, the whole start of the story of Sean being taken when Ethan is having this blackout would have had to be redone and changed. So I do understand why that wasn't possible, why they couldn't just take out every single mention and event of Ethan having a blackout or dialogue moment mentioning bodies. However, part of me can't help but feel like they could have twisted some of the dialogue that they left in the story to make just a bit more sense. Something that I was thinking could have maybe worked is leaning into Ethan's guilt over his son's death and having it manifest in perhaps an unhealthy obsession with the news of all these victims. Out of some sort of trauma and regret that he may hold for Jason, maybe he couldn't help watching the news every single time another 10-year-old child was taken. Maybe he's watching it all hours of the night, waiting and hoping for some amount of good news, and maybe that obsession with following these events causes him his nightmares and visions of dead kids and drowned bodies. They could have been portrayed in a scene with a therapist in which Ethan is perhaps talking of these visions and the therapist asks, "Are you still obsessing over the news of the origami killer?" Or perhaps Ethan says something along the lines of, "Why can't I get these cases out of my head?" Or just something along those lines to maybe portray his infatuation with the stories. They could have changed the lines when he's holding the newspaper to show his sort of emotional attachment and connection to these victims, saying something about perhaps how they spent so much time and effort to try and find this kid, only for him to end up dead. Or perhaps Ethan just gets frustrated at another sad news and death of a 10-year-old boy. Or, I don't know, I just feel like there's ways they could have kept his blackouts in and still ended up resolving the current plot hole that the final game is left with. Now, aside from this massive and really frustrating issue, Ethan is a pretty fun character to play as, since the trials add a lot of excitement and action into the game. His story of losing his son and fighting so hard to save his second one is both heartbreaking and emotional at the same time. The one ending in which he takes his life is truly horrible to see on screen, and it's just such a tragic ending. I don't really have too much else to say about Ethan because he's all around a pretty solid character. There's not much complexity to him though, but in a game that's this short and has this much action and events going on, I kind of feel like it's almost not required. He's a straightforward character. You know that he feels guilty about the death of his first son, and you could tell that he has a lot of fears and anxiety around saving Sean. There's really no secrets or hidden meanings behind any of Ethan's actions or motives, and I think that works really well because, like I said, this game is quite short. There is, however, the tiniest bit of growth in his character. Ethan goes from feeling like this failure as a father because of the death of Jason to realizing that it wasn't his fault. I do think that this is a little bit of a story of healing and learning how to get past the stage of guilt that he feels towards the loss of his firstborn. Now, of course, it is a bit twisted and kind of messed up that he's going through all this in order to heal, but I do feel like he has healed by the end of the game if you do save Sean. Obviously, not everyone is successful at saving Sean, but if you are, at least in terms of his feelings of guilt and being this sort of bad father, I do think that he has resolved those issues and he has at least healed that part of his problems. On a slightly similar note to the issues with Ethan's character, the next plot hole or issue that we have is Madison. Now, similar to Ethan, she also had a few things that were cut from the final release of the game that would have explained a lot of the missing pieces. The original scenes would have explained her nightmares and her insomnia that we see right when she is introduced to us that is left unexplained and unresolved in the final version. I also feel like her being revealed as a journalist comes a bit out of nowhere, which is something that would have also been fixed if they had kept the original scenes. So what would have happened in their original version before they cut it out? Well, Madison was supposed to have a few extra scenes where she would report to her sort of journalism headquarters and end up giving the news an update on Ethan after her encounters with him. We also were supposed to get more information and be informed that she was stationed as a war reporter over in the Iraq wars when she was suddenly attacked by soldiers and witnessed the horrors of war. Her past of being attacked and kidnapped is obviously what she keeps seeing every night in her nightmares. Yet, without us ever learning of this information on our own in the final version, her nightmare sequence feels a bit like an unnecessary scare. Yes, it caused some tension and a rise in energy, but it kind of feels a bit similar to clickbait or like a jump scare or just a bit of a cheap scare, since it doesn't really go anywhere else and doesn't have a deeper meaning. Another issue that I have with Madison is that for a good portion of the story, Madison feels like an accessory to Ethan. That is until they actually argue and she finally goes out of that motel on her own. Leading up to that, since she is just sort of there to heal Ethan and help him escape in the middle of the game, it sort of had me wondering, why are we playing as Madison and not as Lauren? They kind of gave off very similar feelings at that point in the game, so if we were playing as Madison, why couldn't we play as Lauren as well? Now, towards the end of the game, however, Madison's story does pick up and her becoming more of her own character does start to get going, but I can't help but feel the absence of what was supposed to be, I presume, the scenes of her reporting back to headquarters in the middle. I will say, I really liked Madison's optional growth. You kind of have the choice to make her someone that learns that her journalism is about real people. She, by being with Ethan and seeing his experience through his eyes, especially if you make them a couple, will kind of go on to learn that she probably shouldn't write this journal and write this article about him. And opposite of that, you have the option for her to go out and publish this book about the origami killer and tell Ethan's story to the world. Moving on to something that's really crazy about Madison is the idea of her suggesting that they can have another son after Sean dies and Ethan lives. Like, this is just insane. Why is she saying this while Ethan is grieving the loss of both his sons? I know this is a bit of a running on joke about how Madison is saying all this, but it's just baffling that they put this in and they think that it's a good sort of ending for Madison's character development. Like, it is just such a wrong thing to say. No matter who is speaking, they need to have some compassion at this moment. Like, the fact that they made her say this is insane to me. And I know the ending that this happens in is one of the 3 endings that Ethan has where he can take his own life. But still, I just don't understand the logic as to why they would have Madison say this. Like, this is not something you say to someone who just lost their son. It's absolutely crazy to me, so let's just move on. Madison's gameplay does have quite a few little detective moments with her going out to the scenes and trying to find information from all of these people that she is visiting. And while it's fun and enjoyable to play through, I still just can't help but wish that we got a little bit more from her character in the middle part of the story so that she was less of an accessory to Ethan in the beginning. I will say though, I am intrigued as to how they shape Madison's character and personality going into what I believe is the DLC, where she is the main character. I can't help but wonder which sort of ending from Heavy Rain is this version of Madison, or is there no mention of Heavy Rain or the other characters from it, like, for example, Ethan, at all in the DLC? Now, while the remaining characters don't really have any major problems to them, I still want to talk a little bit about their stories before I go on to talk more about the other general problems that this game has. First up is Norman Jayden. He is arguably the best character in the game, and he is definitely the fan favorite, much like Connor is in Detroit Become Human. I have to say, it's really funny playing these games in the sort of wrong order, simply because it's so clear to see which aspects of Norman's character and story they took and sort of advanced in order to create Connor's character in Detroit Become Human. The potential for a good cop, bad cop dynamic, the technological advances and scanning the area for clues, his drive to do the right thing. I mean, Connor is basically Norman's son, okay? They're very similar. Norman's story and his sections of gameplay were absolutely great, and as I already said, some of the best parts of the game were the detective aspects. We got to go and see some unique locations and face new challenges when playing as Norman, and I'd probably say that the fight at the junkyard was easily the best fight sequence in the whole game. As a whole though, following the clues and getting to piece together every single thing from Norman's point of view inside the Ari glasses or not was really enjoyable. I do like the added intrigue of him being addicted to some sort of substance and the Ari glasses. However, I don't know if I love what the end result was. The initial story that I got for him in my first playthrough was that he did not take the drug, the tryptophan, at all. I refused to have him take it, so the eventual twist, or, well, it's not really a twist because you do start to pick up on it as you play the game, but the sort of eventual reveal that the glasses might be causing him some problems And then the ending in which he finally takes off the glasses and still sees the digital tanks, I liked where they were going with this. I actually really enjoyed this sort of ending. I liked how it seems like you're doing the right thing, and then all of a sudden, Norman still gets this sort of mysterious and almost haunting hallucination, which kind of leaves you feeling worried for Norman as you end the game. I thought that was really cool. Norman as a whole has probably the craziest endings, so I want to take some time to talk about them. All of his endings incorporate the vial and the glasses that we're constantly seeing him use. Throughout his gameplay, I was kind of viewing the glasses and this blue vial of tryptocane as two separate addictions, which I'll go on to talk about is entirely wrong. I was and still am a little bit upset and frustrated though, that no matter if you took the vial or not, it kinda had zero impact on the ultimate ending of Norman's story. All of his endings are based on if Norman himself lives or dies, if Sean lives or dies, and if Norman gives up the case or not. Even if you take the drug, every single time the option comes up, as long as you save Sean and Norman lives, he will go on to flush it down the toilet for seemingly no reason, and we will still end up getting this sort of hallucination ending. And I find this to be a bit upsetting since having a different ending based solely on if you as the player decided for Norman to take the vial of tryptocane or not, I think it could have been a really cool optional ending. However, they kind of get away with not having this direct ending simply due to this connection between the vial and the glasses. Because like I said earlier, I was viewing it as separate addictions, separate struggles, which was wrong. I don't know why it took me this long to realize, but the tryptocane vial helps keep Norman from having what seems like either withdrawal symptoms or side effects from the RE glasses. This is most apparent in his fight scene with Mad Jack, in which Norman can stop himself from passing out if you have him use the vial. So when we look at that smoke and mirrors ending, in which I originally interpreted it as a simple drug overdose, due to the fact that this is probably one of the worst endings. In order to get this ending, basically everyone has to die. Madison has to die, Sean has to die, Ethan will end up dying, and Norman has to give up on the case in order to get this ending. So I was kind of seeing it as he took the drug and ended up overdosing just from all the stress and pressure that this case has caused him. However, it is actually a much sadder ending. Norman is stuck in the RE glasses, and he is actually using the tryptocane to try and escape this fictional world that the glasses have created. His overdose is accidental and is a way for him to try and escape the glasses. And I just found this whole incorporation of the two sort of drugs being sort of secretly linked, the tryptocane and the glasses, I found it to be some pretty clever writing. The creators knew that most people wouldn't figure out this connection because of the fact that most people would not take the drug. So unless you took the drug earlier on in the game, and unless you get the smoke and mirrors ending, you won't really figure out this connection right away. And that's what makes it so sort of secretive and effective as well. They try to play it off as two separate addictions, so when you finally realize that it's not, and you realize that they are part of the same issue, I just found this whole story and aspect to Norman's character to be really well done. Of course, it would have been nice if they had added more endings based solely on if you as a player had decided for Norman to take it consistently or not. Mainly, I'm thinking back to that hero ending in which Sean lives and Norman flushes the vial down the toilet no matter what. But as a whole, they do get away with it, and I really liked all of Norman's different endings. Norman is easily my favorite character all around, and he was just such a fun character to play as. Scott's story and his gameplay, it's pretty good, but it's not as exciting as other sections. It does get interesting at times, for example, the whole plotline of going into the Kramer's house, as well as the addition of Lauren. It really helps his story feel a lot more full. There's a decent amount of action, but compared to Norman's detective features, Scott's story does feel just a little bit slow at times, but again, overall, it's pretty good, and I personally like the fact that he is the killer. He's got a solid backstory, and he's clearly got a pretty sick motive behind the killings. While there is a bit of a debate around why he is exactly pinning things on the Kramers though, whether he's just trying to trick Lauren or if it's a bit of a pride situation since the Kramer son did actually try to copy the Origami Killer's MO, I personally think that it's partially his pride. I think he takes pride in his sort of trials and setup for kidnapping kids and attacking the fathers. So the fact that Kramer only took and kidnapped a kid, I think Scott took a little bit of an insult to that. I feel like Scott attacking the Kramers as a bit of a pride action adds another layer of complexity to Scott's character, which is why I also choose to believe that that is the reasoning. Although there is no clear reason in the game as to why he goes about this. One thing I will say, though, about Scott is that it's kind of upsetting or a little bit frustrating that Scott's asthma just suddenly disappears and gets cured halfway through the game. I can't help but wish that we got even just a split second of him needing his inhaler during that big fight scene at the end of the game. Lauren's story running along with Scott, I think it works really good, and I definitely feel that she adds a lot to Scott's story. Frankly, without Lauren, I do feel that Scott would be quite a boring character. Lauren's sort of redemption moment at the end of the game, if Scott Shelby had escaped the encounters at the warehouse, that is a great scene and a perfect ending to her character as we watch her pain and frustration and disgust of Scott being portrayed as she confronts him before shooting him and killing him. Her ending in which she goes to Scott's grave if he dies is equally well made, and I do like the fact that Lauren has some sort of final moment, even though I assume that she must go through a lot of troubles after this occurs, because that's just gotta mess with your head. Like, poor Lauren in this ending. This is a truly awful ending for her, in the sense of it is just so tragic and twisted. She has essentially caught feelings for her son's murderer, and I can't even imagine the sort of emotional turmoil she must be in. I have to admit that after writing this section of the script, I am quite impressed that each of our main characters, except for Scott, who is sort of the antagonist, do have some chance for some sort of character growth and development. At first, going into this when I first started analyzing it, I didn't really think there was any sort of true character growth or development outside of Norman, who has probably the most obvious example in him being able to sort of resign from the FBI and therefore detach from his addiction to the RE glasses. So I do have to give the creators a round of applause for being able to fit in a little bit of character growth in every single character in a game that's under 10 hours long. And even though Scott doesn't truly have a character growth, it kind of is okay, since his true personality and his true character is ever so slowly revealed to us as the game goes on. So it's not really a character development, rather a character realization or a character revelation. So with the characters out of the way, let's talk about some of the more generalized issues and problems that this game has. A huge issue that I think plays a lot into people's frustrations is how bad the police come across at doing their job. How did they miss all of these clues and all of these pieces of evidence in their initial investigations? How did they not notice that the fathers of the kids were disappearing? How did they not know that one of their cop buddies was missing and killed by Jack? It makes them seem really incompetent, which makes some of the aspects of the game, namely Scott's sections, seem just a bit ridiculous sometimes. Like, were the families even trying to save their kids? How did they not tell the cops about this? How did the cops not know about these trials? Like, this has been going on for 2 years and they have not learned about these trials or the origami pieces in the boxes. Similar to this issue of the logic of the cops not really lining up, Scott's setup for these trials is also a bit crazy when you start to think about it. He's killed at least one of the victims' fathers before, based off the interactions with Scott and this mother. That father seemingly attempted the trials, and that is why he has supposedly disappeared. Yet, when Ethan goes to collect the car in the first trial, the garage guy says that it's been there untouched for 2 whole years. So, does Scott just have multiple cars waiting in different garages for the different fathers? Does he have different trials set up for all of the different fathers that he sends a box to? Also, that's just very expensive. Were his adopted parents billionaires? He's got multiple cars, multiple rental properties, he's got plenty of cash, he's got a whole warehouse and factory, and he's completely fine with blowing up all of his furniture and his apartment. Like, Scott is the new Jeff Bezos, okay? Like, he must be filthy rich or something like that. And since we're talking about Scott, how on earth did he get away with the murder of Manfred? The covering up of the noise with the chiming of the grandfather clock is smart, but the issue is that the camera angles in the original scene when you're at Manfred's shop and being able to play as Scott in that scene makes this whole section seem a bit impossible. How was he able to do all of this in such a short amount of time without Lauren noticing? And this is a huge moment where I feel like adding Lauren as a playable character would have benefited the game a lot. I can't help but feel like it would have also been cool to play as her at other points in the game, but in this particular scene, we needed to see things from her point of view in order for this to make sense. It feels just a bit too much like a betrayal to us as players to have Scott suddenly be the killer when we were supposed to be controlling him. It shouldn't be possible for him to do all of this when we were picking his actions and picking his dialogue. Also, just the amount of time doing all of this in 1 minute, once again, doesn't really seem that possible. He kills Manfred, wipes down this sort of typewriter that he hit him with, he calls the police, and then wipes down the phone. Does it technically work? I mean, sure, in theory it does. But in practicality, it's just frustrating to see that this is the sort of answer and how he gets away with things. And again, it so easily could have been fixed if we just played as Lauren. I don't really understand why they didn't want Lauren to be a playable character. She wouldn't have had to have that many different sort of scenes where we would play as her, just enough to sort of make this action and make this moment believable for Scott's character. The next thing we have to talk about is the dialogue. The dialogue in some of the decisions don't always make sense. There are a few instances in the game where the dialogue either feels a bit silly or feels like you're missing something, like you might have missed a clue or you didn't find things in the correct order. Now, of course, this is frustrating to listen to when you are playing through it, but I kind of want to give this one a pass simply because this is the first game to sort of do the branching storyline and decision-based narrative on such a large scale. So yes, it's definitely frustrating to listen to, especially now since a lot of these sort of dialogue interactions have been fixed in most of the modern-day decision-based games that we are probably all used to playing by now. So the little kinks and the issues that this game has are much more apparent since we are used to the slightly more polished-off games of today. So even though compared to today's standard, the dialogue does fall short, because it was so advanced and just a great improvement in terms of the decision-based narrative storytelling games for the time, I'm gonna give this one a pass, even though I think we all know that it's just not up to par with other narrative games. But for its time, it was good, so let's just move on. Something minor that kind of bothered me in the endings of the game is that you don't really see Ethan's ex-wife in most of the happy endings. If Ethan is killed, you will see her and Sean visiting Ethan's grave, but aside from that, the only happy ending in which we see Ethan's ex-wife is if Ethan gets caught and taken to the police station for the end of the game. He will eventually be released as innocent if Norman and Madison save Sean. When he is released from the prison cell, his ex-wife is there with Sean, ready to greet Ethan with a warm, loving hug at seeing his father for the first time after being kidnapped. While this ending is really nice, I couldn't help but feel like she should have at least made an appearance in some of the other happy endings. Even if it's just her hugging Sean, Sean is her son that's been missing and nearly drowned. So to me it made sense that if you got a good ending, you should have at least seen the mother and son reunite. But at the end of the day, that is just a little bit of a preference of mine. So I guess to sort of wrap things up and to answer the big question that we came here today to discuss of does this game hold up to today's standards? Well, the answer is not really. The story is definitely starting to show its age with the lows in its quality of writing. The issue with the plot and the dropped developments for both Ethan and Madison definitely caused huge mysteries that just shouldn't have been left unsolved by the end of the game. The dialogue as a whole and the branching storylines, they're not always perfectly lined up or make perfect sense, which can be a bit frustrating. The mechanics as a whole are definitely showing the worst of the aging in this game, since they can be really aggravating to play through, especially with the walking mechanics, which are just a pain in the butt. However, I will say that I do think that the graphics still hold up pretty well, and the overall tone and events that occur in the game itself are still really exciting and fun to play through. If you're like me and you like to force your friends and family to play decision-based video games as a sort of bonding experience, I would strongly recommend this game because it's just some good quality fun. It's exciting, it's thrilling, it's got some action, and since it's short, it's the perfect game to just play in one night. No matter what your overall feelings are towards the game and the story, I think we can all agree that this game was a huge success in the video game industry, and it went on to launch a huge advancement in video game graphics and in the subgenre of decision-based narrative storytelling games. And for those reasons, this game has my respect. And since I have a feeling one of you guys might ask me this in the comment section, is this game better than Detroit Become Human? I'm not too sure. Heavy Rain, I personally found it to be a much more enjoyable overall experience to play through, but Detroit Become Human has a better story because the story is just much more precise and well written when compared to Heavy Rain. There's no major plot issues like we see here with Ethan and Madison, so for that reason, I think I'd have to say Detroit Become Human. Even though I really thoroughly enjoyed playing through this game, I think I just have to go with the slightly better story. If you guys made it this far into the video, leave a little sunglasses emoji since Norman has his cool RE glasses. And if you liked my discussion, please remember to hit that like button down below and leave your thoughts in the comments section. While you're down there, click subscribe to see more videos from me, and turn on notifications if you want to be notified whenever I post a new video. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I will see you future souls next time. Bye, guys!